Good morning, Blackburn. Is anybody in the room actually from this area? Interesting. Anybody from the UK? Okay, not that many of you. Interesting. And how many of you are from Europe? Okay, further afield? Right, so you will have no idea at all of who I am or what Open UK does. So let me start by introducing myself. 15 years ago, I was a lawyer happily working away in tech, in commercial enterprises, and I got approached to join a company called Canonical, who some of you might know. Canonical is the commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system, and I was employee 165, and I joined to build and run the legal team there. And it was a bit of a journey, right? It's very early stage, and we were the first organization that was hugely impacted by the cloud. So we went from being 0% of the cloud marketplace, I know there's at least one person from Red Hat here, to over 70% of the cloud marketplace almost overnight in 2010. And that was a bit of a shock to us, both in terms of our sudden success, but also in terms of our financial models. So there's a bit of stuff that I'm going to talk to you about as we go through this conversation that comes back to that topic of will open source fail. So I suppose my pedigree in open source started with 5 years at Canonical. I think in those 5 years, my team did 2 transactions in Europe with one provider in the UK, one UK provider who was based in Luxembourg. So back then, we were very early stage for the UK and we're well ahead of the game. Since I left Canonical, I continued to work in and around open source. I've had jobs that haven't been open source jobs, and I've continued to contribute to that sort of governance and legal community around open source. And I've had a whole bunch of different roles. One of my favorites was being in the UN, working for them, obviously pro bono, running their IP and open source advisory for their labs. 2 years ago, 18 months ago, I have a government appointment into the Open Standards Board. Bizarrely, the only recognition of open source within our government advisory boards and boards currently, and we're trying to change that, sits within the Open Standards Board. And there are 2 sort of deep open source experts on that board. Last year, I stood for election for the first time in my life, which is quite a daunting task, and I was elected to the Open Source Initiatives Board. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the OSI and what it does. And really, this is for my sins. I spent 5 years editing this book, and it's often known as the effing book. I have ADHD, and it's 640 pages long and has 26 authors. So it's one of the worst things I ever did, and I won't do it again. But it brings together a text that has all of the experts globally, and not all of them, but the really well-known subject matter experts. So things like trademarks, Pam Chestic, containerization and licensing, you know, the sort of deep topics that you want to know about. But I don't expect you to read 640 pages. In fact, I don't expect anybody other than me will ever read it cover to cover. And I had to do it 5 times, I might point out. It's really well indexed, or it's as well indexed as we could be. So I mean, the first index they sent me, I made 100 changes to. And I've tried to use language that would be recognizable to engineers. Now, I'm not trying to sell you my book. You can buy it if you like, I really don't care. This QR code takes you through to my website, and it's available on an open access license. Technically, that's non-commercial, but who's got to look? So if you want a copy, or you've got people in teams that you work with who you think it would help to understand open source more, I think it's a really helpful text. Embarrassingly almost, because it took so long to do, when we spec'd it, we didn't include AI. So 6 years ago, it wasn't on the horizon for us. So we will do something to fix that, and you can expect to see something released around the sort of law and policy of AI, coming soon to a bookshop near you. But bizarrely, when we launched it last year, we had 6 of the female authors. I've said there's 26 authors, and we had 6 of them at All Things Open. If any of you don't know All Things Open, it's one of my favorite conferences in Raleigh, North Carolina. I think it's about the 4th to the 6th of October this year. And we did this panel session and then a book giveaway. And it went viral on the Chinese internet. I mean, of all the places, right? So the book's now been translated into Mandarin, and it's going to be published there later this year. I guess I spend a lot of my life doing stuff like this. There's pros and cons to this, but I get to travel the world talking about open source and meeting up with the leadership. And in a role like mine, you represent the whole of your organization and community. I always feel awkward about these kind of things, so I get put forward for various awards and stuff. This is the first one that really matters. So about 2 weeks ago, they put me on this list. And this list is Computing, which is one of the big UK journals, top 100 leaders in IT. And I think there are 3 women who run not-for-profits there. And they're not the usual suspects. It's not Tech UK, it's not the big BCSs, the established UK organizations. And for open source to have got onto that agenda is such a big step for us in the UK. You know, it's really not about me, it's about Open UK and what it brings. Almost everybody else on there is a CIO or a CTO of a major company in the UK. So Open UK, we have a purpose of UK leadership and global collaboration in open source. We started 3.5 years ago. The initial purpose was UK leadership, and we realized that that's not what we're about after a year, and that everything we do is collaborative and works globally. We're made up of a huge group of people. So because we only have 2 employees, it often looks like just me to the world. But we've actually got a couple of 100 people who volunteer for us. Our board is made of rock stars. Very strangely, if I talk about them in the UK, and I'm not in a room full of open source people, I'm with the general tech sector, they have no clue. And I've actually started to write a blog post. Where is she? Yeah, bottom left. My blog post is titled, How Can You Not Know Who Liz Rice Is? Because if I take her to the Bay Area, every VC, you know, is salivating. Yeah, in the UK, they don't know who she is. And this is a major problem that we've got. Liam Maxwell, who is or was the CTO, I think, for UK government maybe 10 years ago, he described open source to me as the submarine under the digital economy. And it really is what we are in the UK. And I'm going to encourage you through this talk, I hope, to up Periscope. But you can see our community, and we have a leadership team that are mostly pro bono. We have ambassadors, and there's always room for more ambassadors if getting involved with us is of interest. The ambassador role is intentionally very, very light touch. It's about being part of that community. It's about sharing things on social media. It's about collaborating with the rest of the team. And what it does is it really builds networks. It's a bit like what's happening with Dan in this conference. You know, you are not focused collectively on one project or one technical output, and that's unusual for open source. And I think we're the first country organization that has really shifted the model and brought people together. Now, how we've done it is that the other country organizations, they focus on homegrown companies. They focus on the SMEs because that's what they are in their area. There are very few companies across Europe that scale. I mean, there are some. We've got Snyk, we've got Weaveworks, we've got a bunch of others in the UK, but there are very few that scale in the European or the UK domestic markets currently, and we want to change that. So by focusing on the people in our geographic area, we get the opportunity to bring you all together. It doesn't matter who you work for, you can be part of this organization. And we purposely have ensured that our leadership is right across the UK to encourage people in rural areas and different parts of the UK to engage and get involved. And one of the benefits of volunteering, and Dan and I were talking about this last night, is that we do a load of events that go under the radar because we can't sell tickets. So I'll talk to you in a minute about our awards. Last year, I missed it because I had COVID, but last year there were 120 people in the House of Lords in black tie from our community. Nobody paid to be there. We raised the sponsorship for it, and we brought the awards nominees, we brought the sponsors in, but then the rest of the tickets go to our community and our volunteer community, and we do a lot of events through the year like that. And we do that thanks to our sponsorship. But key to everything we do is this sense of belonging. And you may have noticed in those photos that we had a higher number of women, maybe not quite as diverse ethnically as I'd like to see, but definitely a more mixed and diverse community of people coming together. So that community is really central to what we do. And we try to pull the community together so we've got a cohesive community in the UK. I mentioned our awards. This is the 2021 awards. This is the sponsors for last year. And then we also do an honours list, and it's a bit of a, does anybody know what an honours list is? Right, it's a very, very British thing. So the Queen and now I guess the King He's just given his first one out, and a whole load of controversy. If you Google it, you'll find he's given honours to people that may not deserve them. Our honours list is different. So the tradition of the honours is that it's to recognise contribution in a field. And what we do each year is we recognise 100 people for their contributions to open source. And we started with the big influencers, and we've done next gen, and we've done a bunch of stuff with contribution. This year we're going to break it down into different categories. Tonight I've got to head back to London. I was slightly distracted when Dan called out my name because my train's just been cancelled, so you never know, Dan, I might be at a gala dinner. But we have a meet-up tonight. And we take that community and we take your collective voice to have influence. And we've got a bunch of lawyers involved, we've got a bunch of policy people who help us to have influence on laws and policies. So we respond to laws. This week we responded to the US Patent Office, who are looking at restricting the ability to challenge patents. So when they issue patents, very little prior art's looked at, and a lot of the open source stuff gets missed. So when patent trolls attack, what we tend to do through Open Invention Network is we challenge those patents as a community. So we responded saying they can't take that away because it will destroy innovation. So we do that kind of thing a lot. We do a lot of policy work, and the policy work is quite varied. So we started reporting in 2021, and we did 3 reports. Last year we did 1, which was a kind of bumper report. This year we've learned that 1 bumper report isn't the best way to go. So we issued it last year, and Boris Johnson stepped down the same day, and we got completely overshadowed across the press. So we've got 4 bites at the cherry this year with a 4-phase report. We've just closed a survey which had 339 responses. Now that probably sounds really small. I was totally shocked by this kind of stuff because it's not my background, but the survey feedback that you get tends to be in the low hundreds. So the Linux Foundation, last year they did a Europe-wide survey, and they had just over 600 responses for the whole of Europe. And our survey was hard to do, and it was hard to do because we needed a lot of very detailed data about who you employ, what they do, the hours that are there for contribution to open source, the amount that your company turns over. And it's a lot of stuff, and it was a lot of stuff because we put it into a methodology to do an economic calculation. And Open UK has constantly pushed the barrier on this. And we pushed the barrier because the way that open source has been measured traditionally has been around total cost of ownership, around number of devs, around lines of code contributed. But if you think about that inbound, feed, what that doesn't recognize is the breadth of the value that comes out the other end. And what we're trying to do is shift to a more value-focused view. So in 2021, using 2020 data, we could show 20% of the UK's GDP and our digital economy came from open source. That was using the model the Commission used. I think it's very old school. It's all about total cost of ownership. If we can get to that other end in values, my guess is we can show 3 times that contribution to the digital economy. And that's what makes people take notice and listen to us. We do a lot of policy work around sustainability. Open source has a huge alignment to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. We had a large event for a couple of hundred people at COP26. 2 years on, we have an event free to attend in Edinburgh if anybody's interested. And we issued at COP26 a blueprint for the data center of the future using open tech. This year we've got an EV charging equivalent, and we're working to build communities around those. So we take the community's voice, we have influence in law and policy, and we also build learning. So we've got 2 kids camps that teach what open source is, teach how to code, and teach about sustainability. And this year we're working with Strathclyde University, and we're building a MOOC, a massive open online course, which will also be free to attend. And that will teach the business of open source software. And one of the things that we found is that if you compare the UK to the Bay Area, why do our businesses scale, and why don't they scale? So our businesses scale in the Bay Area, they don't scale here. And they scale there firstly because of the geographic space. The US is a huge market, but in a digital economy, we should be able to tap into that. They scale because they get better investment, because there's better risk understanding. The investors know the terms better. And they scale because the local skills are there around the engineering. We know we've got the best engineers in the world. We know that we come up with great ideas. But what we don't have is the skill sets to support them, the commercialization. And the goal of the MOOC is to try to teach that. So just a little bit on that. So I want to get to the meat of, or actually I want to just talk about this first. So State of OpenCon happened for the first time in February. We had 800 people. It was the UK's first, for many years at least, big open source conference. And I want to again mention the diversity there. We had almost 40% women attend, so I've got speakers first, right? So we had nearly 40% of the speakers were female, not enough ethnicity. But if you look at our delegates, we had almost 50% of the room who weren't white. And that must be unheard of in the UK at any conference, let alone a tech conference. It doesn't just happen, it takes work. But this is the diverse workforce of the future. These are the people we need to engage going forwards to keep our communities strong and building forward. And again, this all happens thanks to our sponsors, and we managed to engage a huge amount of community. So this just gives you an idea of what we're doing in the next 12 months. And when you look at this end, you'll see things like party conferences. This is a first for us, and this is part of our influencing. There's an election next year, which I'll come to towards the end, and we want to have an impact on that election. So what is open source? Back to basics. I said I was a board member of the Open Source Initiative, the OSI, and the OSI's job is to be the guardian of the open source definition. And the open source definition has 10 points, which you should all be able to recite, but you won't be able to, and I can't either. And I've never been in a room with anybody apart from a lawyer called Louis Villa, who I think can do it. So these 10 definitions are critical to what open source is, and I always get hung up on 5 and 6. And I get hung up on 5 and 6 because they're so fundamental, and when things go wrong, it tends to be around them. And 5 is that it can be used by anybody, and 6 is for any purpose, which means that when you release your software, once it's out there in an open source license, and to be an open source license, it has to meet these 10 definitions and be OSI approved. Anything else causes confusion. To be that, it needs to allow anybody to use the code for any purpose. And sometimes there's confusion, particularly as we see more and more adoption of open source, around that commercial piece. So when I was at Canonical, it was really tough, right? All the commercial deals escalated up to me for 5 years, and we were banging on doors where we were blocked. And we were blocked by the risk professionals and organizations, the lawyers, the procurement team, the finance team. And that shifted, right? That shifted over the last 10 years, particularly the last 3 to 5. And I think it shifted for a bunch of reasons. The first, and again, Dan and I were talking about this last night, is the elevated status of the engineers. So we live in a digital economy, and in that digital economy, every company is digitalized, which means they are tech dependent, which means they're software defined. You can't escape it. So anybody of any size needs engineers, needs devs, which means the devs suddenly have power, and they're the decision makers, and if you're selling, they're your sales audience. And in that elevated status, they now can bring open source into their organizations through GitHub, through GitLab, in a way they never used to be able to. We had Launchpad at Canonical, hey-ho. GitHub has been super successful, and it's the way that most people will bring code into their organization, and it bypasses those risk professionals. You do not need a contract anymore. You use a standard OSI-approved license. From the risk professionals' perspective, what that means is that they ought to be looking at policies and procedures for people bringing the code into the company, and it needs to be stuff that's workable for the engineers. But that's made a big shift, and it's one of the main reasons that open source has become so successful. The final one that I always pick on is cloud. Yesterday, UK government issued a new set of policies around our use of cloud in government and the public sector, and it requires the use of public cloud wherever possible, and there's a set of sort of criteria you have to meet not to use it. And the public cloud is entirely built on open source. So back in 2018, my mate Steve Wally, who's the head of open source at Microsoft, was on a stage in Edinburgh talking about open source, and he was keynoting the Linux Foundation Open Source Summit. And Steve said that Microsoft, who were then the biggest contributor and still are to open source in the world, had been on a journey. Now, when I joined Canonical 15 years ago, I knew a lot of open source jokes, and every joke I knew, the punchline was Microsoft, right? I no longer tell those jokes. I mean, between us, we had this thing called Bug Zero on Launchpad, which was the destruction of Microsoft. Clearly that didn't happen, and they learned the error of their ways. So how did they learn the error of their ways? What's this journey? Well, Steve describes it for 3 reasons, and the first sort of aligns with what I've just been saying to you. Every developer who's learned to code in the last 20 years uses open source. They use open source software, they use the code, but they also use open source methodologies. So if you want to hire, you have to let people use open source. His second reason was that there was some innovation that you really could only get as open source, things like containerization. So their customers were specifically asking them for open source products. And then the third thing is the cloud. And as I just said to you, you can't use cloud without using open source. If you want to run a cloud business, you can't just use it, you also have to be engaged with those communities. And for me, those are the biggest of the fundamental changes that have caused this shift in adoption. And we don't just see that in the public sector, and the private sector rather, we see it in the public sector. During lockdown, almost every COVID app was set out in open source. The NHS in the UK, the biggest healthcare provider in the world, has an open source first strategy. And the Energy Task Force in the UK delivered its report January last year. And it delivered its report saying it wanted to build a spine of open source software for the UK energy sector. So we've won right, let's go home. Except it's not quite that simple, and you're probably starting to see the friction. So the first piece of friction that I want to talk about is curation. And curation's a term that Eric Brewer at Google came up with. He's VP of Infrastructure in the Bay Area. Eric came up with this curation term to talk about how you do open source well. So it's all very well saying that open source is adopted, but if you're not curating it well, you're going to have problems. And curation is the good technical hygiene, the processes, the procedures, and the good governance. So a combination of those two. And in our reporting last year, we focused on use. We split it into consuming, contributing, and distributing open source software. And what you see as you follow that journey and you look at the longevity of organizations in each of those stages, what you see is improvements in their governance, improvements in their processes. And us getting that understanding into the public sector and into government is going to be really critical. Because if they're not doing it well, they're not going to get value from open source. I did some mentoring last year for 6 projects, and they were given £300,000 each by British government. And they have all put their code on GitHub on an open source initiative approved license. Now that's what they've done, because there are no criteria saying they have to develop in the open. There's nothing that says they have to take contributions. There's nothing that says they have to collaborate. There's nothing that says they have to maintain the project. You going to use that code? Nobody's going to use that code, apart from the people that created it. So we have to get this shift in understanding across of what open source really is and all the goodness around it. Things like the IP and the governance around trademarks, which have come in really handy to certain organizations, and patents. We have the biggest defensive IP organization in the history of IP in OIN, and it's a collaborative organization, free to join, click-through license, where everybody who joins says that they'll share patents. And the biggest thing that Microsoft did on their journey was to join OIN and share their patents with the whole open source community. So, talk a bit about curation, but an even bigger problem for us is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And the reason we struggle with this is that what open source is to any commercial market, what open source is disruption, right? And nobody likes being disrupted. If you're an incumbent and you've got a revenue stream and some upstart comes along and disrupts that revenue stream, you are not going to be happy and you are going to fight back. And it's something that we experienced in Canonical with the operating system as we moved to a Linux operating system. And it's something that's really live today. We see it within our own communities. So back in 2008, as a newbie to open source, I saw the first report on what business models work with open source. And this came out in October 2008. There are 8 models there, and those models haven't really changed. They've got different names, but they haven't really changed in the last 15 years. If this interests you, it really interests me. It's what I wrote my book chapter on within the book I showed you earlier. Then, go look at that. But what you see is that there's a lack of understanding, and that lack of understanding goes back to definitions 5 and 6. If you put your code out there into the marketplace, it is available to anybody for any purpose. Now, my old boss at Canonical, Mark Shuttleworth, did a podcast for open source underdogs. If you're interested in commercialization of open source underdogs has about 90 podcasts interviewing founders. It's just the best. And in Marx, he says that you are enabling your competitors with your own innovation. And that's difficult, right? And he describes it as financially and emotionally draining, which is putting it mildly. So before you get into open source, before you distribute your code as open source, if you want to commercialize, you need to have some clue about your business model. And you need to understand that you are giving your code to other people to compete with you. And that's something that not everybody who's run open source has understood. This headline came out during lockdown from Shay Bannon, the founder of Elastic. And the reason it was problematic is that Elastic were actually moving away from an open source license to one that was restrictive. Yet they were sort of being disingenuous, saying that they were doubling down on open. If that, again, is something that you're interested in, Adam Jacobs is probably co-founder of Chef. He's probably the best person whose talks and blogs and things you can listen to on that. But that understanding of what open source really is and how to commercialize it is one of our first problems in FUD. Very, very relevant to your sector is standards. So the whole of the mobile sector works on standards. And standards are great, right? Open source effectively creates de facto standards. It allows interoperability. The problem is that if you have a standard that has patents in it, even if those patents are on FRAND licensing, which fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory, right? Everybody pays the same to access those patents. The word pays should be the trigger. Everybody pays. And that paying conflicts with some of the open source licenses, but more importantly, I think, it conflicts with the whole ecosystem and the free flow of open source. So when you look at telco, when you look at voice, when you look at mobile, what you see is these standards causing friction with innovation. And what we need is a change, and we really need a change towards open standards that aren't inhibited by patents, and we need to see more of those in place, and if they can't be put in place and there are patents, what we need is more of this OIN, collaborative sharing. Back in, I think, 2011, the Nortel patents were sold to a group called Rockstar, which included Microsoft and Apple at the time. And they were going to release those patents into the marketplace to attack open source, but with a license to themselves. So they were going to have a third party do the dirty work for them. And the Department of Justice in the US got involved, and the way they solved that problem was to give this license to the open source community through OIN. But these are not the only sort of areas where we have FUD and problems. We have seen the Log4j, Shell4j, Heartbleed, and other security vulnerabilities. You must all know those. They're inescapable. And what those have done is make governments realize that not just open source, but all software is vulnerable. And if we're sitting in this digitalized world that I've talked to you about, and we're seeing governments looking at their infrastructure becoming digital in a way it never has been before, they're understanding for the first time that they're vulnerable, and they're vulnerable to attack, and they're vulnerable to security issues. And the US has taken a major lead on this. They started in 2021 with SBOM, Software Bill of Materials, a recipe that you have to create for your open source to distribute it to any federal government department. This year, they've started to consult with business and industry because they want to make sure that they deal with this risk. Somebody somewhere is going to be liable, and they're working out who it is in that supply chain. We like the US approach because the US is trying to avoid putting that burden back on you, the developers. They're saying that the open source community will not be liable. I mean, it would just be unworkable, you would think, if they did. Yet, in Europe, the European Commission is saying you will be liable. Well, maybe, maybe not. Very, very confused legislation, the Cyber Resilience Act. It's gone down like a lead balloon with the open source community. Almost every major organisation, apart from Open UK, has attacked the Commission and sent them letters attacking them. Post-Brexit, it doesn't really seem appropriate for us to be doing that, which is why we've not engaged. But this legislation is really worrying, and it comes with massive fines that apply anywhere in the world if your software is distributed in Europe. They've gone a step further, and they've started to look at product liability for software and for open source software. Again, unworkable, something that just can't go through. In the UK, we've got similar consultations going on. This one closed in May on the security side, but the UK government seems to be really following what the US is doing. Now, we do updates and briefings around this. We do something called the Summer of Open Source Software Security that was really well received last year. And this FUD, this concern, I mean, it started by being focused on security, but actually it's broader. And we see things like this article from Atlantic Council talking about open source being a house of cards in our national infrastructure and critical infrastructure. And what we're seeing is these policy people who have different levels of understanding of open source, engaging with governments and having an impact, setting their policies, setting their agendas. And we're doing this in a time where, you know, the Europeans are talking about this being the digital decade. We see the split in the UK with Brexit. I mean, I don't think there's a geopolitical shift that is more obvious than Brexit, right? This is FOSDEM. Many of you have been to FOSDEM back in 2020, right before lockdown. And a bunch of the Open UK team were in Brussels, and we went to the Commission because we were Brexiting. We just went there at midnight. It was quite sad. And they turned the lights out on us, and it's pretty much been the same since. But you see these shifts in geopolitics that you don't really think has anything to do with software. And you see it with you know, the EU and China, the US and China, the UK and China. And you see it with people. You don't just see it at that global government level. You see it with people. And you see people taken to the streets through lockdown and Black Lives Matter. You see kids on the streets of Glasgow for COP26 talking about sustainability. But all of this has an impact on software because they're looking at changing the laws, changing and in creating restrictions on us and our collaboration cross-border. And as I said to you about the purpose of Open UK, that international collaboration is fundamental to everything we do. And I think the ultimate problem we've seen in the last few years is war. Something that feels very close to home for those of us in Europe. And from war came this concept of protestware. And you know, we work with some of the devs in Ukraine, but you can't condone the protestware that restricts Russian access, because what that does is breach the OSD. It goes back to this idea that we are non-judgmental as an international community. We have no ethical view on open source. It's available for anyone to use for any purpose. And even if it's a well-merited reason, if we start to break that, we break the whole ecosystem. So these are some of the FUDs and the frictions that we have to deal with in today's environment, even although we're successful. But I couldn't leave you without talking about the elephant in the room, AI. And oh, what fun we're having with that, right? So OpenAI, not really open, but it started with the intention of being open. Elon Musk will tell you that it was meant to be a foundation, an open source foundation for AI. Then we see reports like this. Is a really good article in the New Stack about how the open source communities and the development that we're doing is going beyond the big companies and the arms race for ownership of AI and innovation. And part of the reason that the open communities are having this success is that in February, Meta, they shared a large language model, an LLM, and they shared Llama, double L, small a, capital M-A. They shared Llama. Innovation and the quality of innovation is happening so rapidly that these big companies can't keep up. So problems that had taken months and months of small teams of AI experts and data scientists working on suddenly were being solved in weeks. You can see things like the ability to spin up to spin up your own AI in an evening and to do it on your phone, that kind of thing that just didn't exist before. And I mentioned, you know, Zuckerberg. One of the things that he was doing this week, and you see it here, he met Marguerite Vestager, the European VP for digital, I think 3 or 4 days ago now, and he met her to talk about regulating, creating some guidance around open source AI, some sort of restriction. And it goes back to the same things that I was talking about before, people regulating and creating policies around open source. These are going to affect you, right? I sat in a room in 2019 in the European Commission where they suggested they would regulate the right to code. I got the privilege of answering that and had a round of applause from the developers in the room, because you can't do it. It's a freedom of speech, right? It's why we're all here. It's fundamental to what you do. But our regulators don't understand the detail. They don't understand the nuance. We see this AI summit, which is now happening in December in the UK, and we've had a consultation on AI running since March. Now, the good news is there's a sudden panic around open source. So last week I met the AI minister in a round table where they recognised the need to have an open source voice at the table. And we have an AI roundtable of engineers meeting that office in a couple of weeks' time. The Open Source Initiative had its first meeting yesterday in California to set out an open source AI definition. And we're going to bring that into the work we do with UK government, and we're hoping that all governments in the world will start to look to that and collaborate around what that definition should be and what, if any, requirements there should be around it. But that should be with a community voice and an understanding of how open source works and what it really is. So the future, is open source going to fail? We in the UK have the world's first open source first policy. It's 11 years old now, completely out of date, and it needs refreshed. It needs refreshed to the extent that when I'm talking to people in policy, people in government, I often have to explain tech's a pizza to get them to understand what open source is. And take this away if you take nothing else away, because when you speak to people who are in this space, this is what they will understand if they have no tech understanding. If tech's a pizza, what you are interested in is the toppings. When you go to a restaurant, that's what you want to talk about. And in tech, those toppings are like AI, ML, blockchain, the cloud, the internet, I could go on. Those toppings sit on a base, and effectively that base is open source software. Nobody's interested in the base, right? You might get a choice of two, nobody's really going to go there in a restaurant. But if you take the base away, what you're left with is a sloppy mess. And we need that base in place, and we need our governments to start to recognize it. So I mentioned at the right-hand part of a slide, and we'll share the slides, that we were looking at the election. There'll be an election in the UK sometime between May and October next year, we think. And we have already submitted to the Labour Party a set of asks, and we've set out what the status quo is, what we want, things like money invested in open source, skills development, better practices in government around how open source is managed, what that will achieve, and why it's important. And one of the key things there is showing them the value. You know, politicians like economics, so showing that economic value is going to be critical. But you may also have noticed Keir Starmer spoke at London Tech Week last week. And when he spoke at London Tech Week, he talked about public good. And he talked about public good and the future of technology, but he talked about it in terms of data. And we need him to understand that open source is a digital public good, and it's fundamental to the future of technology, not just in the UK, but globally, and that we need the ability to collaborate and input into these policies and processes. So I think my call to arms to all of you is that if you look at the Open UK website and you're in the UK, at the top there's a newsletter. Even if you only subscribe for a little while, please subscribe. Those asks that we've made of the Labour Party, we're making them of all political parties, and we're trying to get into their manifestos. And in a couple of weeks' time, before Parliament breaks up for the summer, we'll be sharing a draft letter, and we'll be asking everyone to send them to their current MPs. And then again later in the year, we'll be asking them to send them to the prospective candidates once the election's announced. So I'm going to leave you at that. I'm happy to do questions, but I'm sure I'm over time. We good?
We've got 3 minutes for questions.
They're probably overwhelmed, it's pretty dense.
If people have questions. Do we have any questions? You can talk to Amanda after the session as well. They're digesting.
Go on, ask me a question. Somebody be brave. No?
No.
No.
No,
Okay.
they're digesting.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. So a couple of things before we break for a couple of minutes. So Platinum sponsors, they're in a room over there. There's 2 rooms over there, both Telet and Element. Go and see them. They make this conference happen. And then Everycast Labs will be selling our T-shirts in the conservatory during the breaks today. So £20 instead of 25. And when they're gone, they're gone. We did a very small print run to gauge interest. And one final note, one of our last sessions of the day from Paolo is no longer happening. And so the last session of the day from Vim and Duncan will be in this room with everyone. No pressure. Thank you very much. And yeah, see you all in 7 minutes time back in here or in the Townley suite.